for the introduction, Ian, and it is fabulous to be here talking about 3D printing in forensic science. So I'm going to sort of split. I know this remote forensic CSI does a lot of the teaching aspect as well. So I'm going to split my time sort of speaking in a teaching concept, but also in a research context as well. Just because by the very nature of what we do as forensic scientists, actually, when you sort of drill down to the core of it, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to have lay people understand essentially what we're trying to talk about, the science behind the forensics. So whether that be in court as you're presenting evidence in court, or whether that be when you're in a lecture and you're presenting to undergraduate students, postgraduates, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to instill these principles and have people come along on a learning journey with us. So both quite important things. As a little bit of an introduction, I'm a lecturer in forensic anthropology at Keele University, and really I'm a multidisciplinary researcher. So I've got lots of research interests, ranging from forensic anthropology and taphonomy, so that's bones and bodies and burials and that sort of thing. But also in terms of human anatomy from an evolutionary point of view, and then a comparative anatomy point of view, so comparing how animals are different to humans. My PhD was based in biomechanics, so that's where a lot of my research sort of thoughts and processes come through, but a big part of that is biomedical imaging and other 3D imaging techniques, and then of course the 3D printing that comes as almost like the rematerialization process. So we can think of these processes of, you have a piece of evidence, I digitize it, so I put it into the virtual world, it becomes a digital model, and I then 3D print them and rematerialize it as a physical model again. So it's that journey from physical to virtual to physical again, that you can do for anything, but today I'm going to talk about 3D forensic science, so that process specifically applied to forensic evidence. So in order to do that, I'm going to start talking about forensic imaging, or 3D imaging, sorry, and printing more generally. So basically, what actually is it? What do we mean by these things? And then introduce you to a new subfield that has been defined by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Rachel Currew, who has coined this phrase 3D forensic science, or 3DFS. So we'll talk through a little bit about that. Think about how 3D imaging and printing is really useful for teaching of forensics, but then also in terms of that casework as well. And then think about some current issues and future directions that are coming up and presenting themselves with this sort of technology. So, introduction to 3D imaging and printing then. So let me get my little laser pointer. This here is a 3D printer. It's going to be there all the way through. I'm very proud. It sits right next to me actually at the moment, just out of a shot. And this is a 3D locust for anyone who is interested. But it's been a long time since some of us might be old enough to remember this being our relationship with 3D technology, 3D films, where I was talking to students not long ago about having treats in cereal boxes. And it's been a long time since that's been a thing. I've realised I haven't eaten cereal since I was about 12. But we used to have these things in cereal boxes, and sometimes it would be these 3D glasses. So you had one lens was red, one lens was blue, and then perhaps on the back of the cereal box you had this image, and you could, because of the stacked nature of the 2D image, you would then be able to see it in 3D using these glasses. If you're going to go to watch a 3D film these days, you would be given not quite these glasses, but something similar that allows those images to be stacked up on top of each other. So basically what you see is 3D. And as you can tell from this image, it's very exciting when that happens. So we like engaging with media that is in 3 dimensions. So very, very exciting. But there's lots of different ways that we can interact with 3D. So yeah, exactly. And love free stuff in serials. Don't get enough free things in serials these days. So all 3D models have 3 dimensions. But not all 3D models are presented in 3D. So that's a bit of a mind-bending statement when we think about it. So all 3D models, of course, have 3 dimensions, but it depends on how we present those 3D models as to whether we are actually interacting with them in 3 dimensions. So I'm going to start off talking through how we approach this 3D-ness. How do we want to visualize things in 3D? Well, there's many different technologies that we can use to create a 3D model. And these technologies, they might be contact versus non-contact, active versus passive, or surface versus transmission. And so these different technologies, when we're thinking about contact, if anyone has had a ultrasound scan, the ultrasound probe needs to be in contact with the thing that it's imaging. But you might have non-contact. So, for example, a digital photograph, the camera doesn't need to be in contact with the thing that you're trying to image because we're working on the principles of light. Similarly, with active versus passive, you might be actively firing something out, so X-rays or laser light, or you might be collecting something passively, so how just the general ambient light is interacting with the object. And then you've got surface versus transmission. So are you just looking at the surface topography of the object you're looking at, or are you wanting to see through it? So thinking about things in terms of, are you just looking at the outside, a bit of an Easter egg shell, or are you looking through it like an X-ray? Are you passing through all of the layers of that tissue or whatever it is that you're imaging? And then, of course, alongside those different imaging techniques, you also have different print types. And I'm going to speak about those in a bit more detail in a moment. But there's different print types and different materials. So lots of different technology can make things 3D. And as I sort of alluded to in that statement at the top there, we can interact with that technology and those models virtually or physically. So we have digital models. So as I showed you here, this is a digital model. It's got 3 dimensions. I could spin it around if it wasn't just a screenshot of it, but it is just a digital version. You could also have that visualizes in VR, AR, XR. So this is virtual reality, augmented reality, or extended reality. And then also we can talk about that process of moving from the virtual back to the physical realm with physical 3D prints. So you can think of these as a bit like a scale. So digital model purely in the virtual realm, everything you are working on is digital. 3D prints, everything is in the physical realm, everything you're working on is tangible, you can feel it, you can hold it. VR, AR and XR are sort of a blend between the two. So you are presenting digital models, but in such a manner that you are tricking the brain into thinking that you are in a physical environment. So you're using sound, space, that 360 visualization to sort of entice the brain into thinking that the virtual things that you're seeing are physical, like you could almost reach out and touch them. You can interact with the virtual world. And then, of course, as I alluded to as well, the presentation matters. So this idea that all 3D models are 3D, but they're not always presented in 3D, comes from the fact that 3D digital models are presented on our screen in 2 dimensions. So yes, we can interact with them, we can zoom in, we can zoom out, we can spin them around, but ultimately they're not popping out at the screen towards us, they are still being presented in 2D. And then, as I mentioned, that VR, AR, XR technology gives the illusion of it being 3D, but ultimately it's virtual. There's still only 2 dimensions. But it's the 3D prints that then offer that tactile 3D-ness, so that you've got that extra sense being awakened there by touching and feeling the model. This slide is sort of dedicated to just really thinking about surface versus transmission before I start talking about the different print technologies that are out there. So in terms of surface, just capturing the surface topography, if I take this Costa coffee cup, we're just looking at the outside surface, we're not interested about what's inside. We can use things like structured light, laser scanning, photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is a technique where you take a lot of pictures, 360 around the whole object, and software uses matching features to create a 3D model out of those 2D photographs. Laser technology, obviously, clue is in the name, uses laser light to interact with the surface of the object, and works on the principle that the laser is going to take a certain amount of time to reach the object, interact with it, and bounce back. And the software that you're using uses that time of travel information to make an estimate about how far away that object is, thus what the surface topography is like. And then structured light uses a similar principle, but instead of laser light, it's visible light, white light, and you're using sort of patterns of light. So they interact, you shine a pattern of light, maybe banding, and as you can see, as my hands wrap around the cup there, they're no longer straight. They've wrapped around, so they've distorted, and that's the idea behind using structured light, is the software looks at the distortions in the pattern and can then interpret something about the surface topography that way. When we think about surface technology then, and I love using the analogy of a loaf of bread, you are just looking at the crust of the bread. You're not interested about what's in the middle, you are looking at just the surface on the outside. With the transmissive techniques then, so CT scanning, which is an X-ray based technique, and MRI, which is a proton excitation based technique, you are looking at the transmission of certain things through. So you're building up a volume of that model. You're no longer just looking at the surface. So back to our coffee cup, you're looking about what's inside. You're going to be looking at all the layers. You're going to be looking at the liquid that's inside. You're going to be able to see all of the layers that have made up the outer plastic surface of this, or the glitter that's inside, those sorts of things. And so you can think about that in terms of our loaf of bread as though you're looking at the slices, and this sort of mimics how CT and MRI is collected, because it is collected in a series of slices that your software puts together and creates this 3D model for you. So you have both the crust, the surface, but also the internal information as well. So you've got some information about what the middle of the bread looks like. Lovely. When we then use 3D printing, you can use 3D printing to rematerialize any 3D model. So it can come from surface or it can come from transmissive. It doesn't matter. As long as you've got the 3D file, you can produce a 3D print of it. And this can be done in multiple different ways. The one I'm going to focus on is additive manufacturing, and that essentially means that you're adding materials. So additive, you're adding material, you're building prints up layer by layer. And there's 3 different ways that this can happen. FFD here stands for fused filament deposition, and this is where you're using melted filament layers. You're squirting out layers of material and looks a bit like this. So you can see this print head here is moving along, it's tracing an outline, and at the same time it's squirting out heated plastic and building up those layers. I'm just going to zoom on a little bit further, and you can see that you're starting to build this up off of the build plate, and you're getting your 3D model built up that way. Here, the difference between fused filament deposition and stereolithography is you're still building prints up layer by layer, but there's a slight difference in how you build those layers up. So instead of squirting out liquid filament or melted filament, you're using a vat of resin at the bottom, and you're shining a laser light that polymerizes each layer. So you can imagine you've got your print bed and a laser light shines through, hardens one surface, you bring it up a layer, hardens the next layer, brings it up a layer, hardens the next layer, so that you end up building a 3D model that way. So you can see the kit looks similar in some respects, slightly different in other respects, in that you've got a print bed and you can see that laser light shining. This build platform is exactly the same as what we saw in the first one. And you have the resin underneath. And you can see each layer, it builds up, draws the platform up, and you have your 3D model. And then the last one here, selective laser sintering, works on quite a similar premise to stereolithography, but instead of using this liquid resin and laser polymerization, you're using a powder bed with adhesive. So you're squirting out, your bed of powder already exists. In the pattern, you are squirting out an adhesive, much like the laser is tracing out in SLA, and then you brush over a layer of powder, again with the adhesive, brush over a layer of powder. So you're still building things up layer by layer, you're just using a slightly different technology to do so. Just gonna zoom on a bit there. So you'll notice that these are a lot bigger. These 2 are sort of desktop machines. This is quite a large machine. This one uses a laser. You can use adhesive as well. So you can see each of those work on the premise that you're building up layer by layer. And that's really exciting. One of the questions that we want to think about, though, is there's lots of techniques out there. So which technique do I use and when do I use it? So if we think about imaging at step 1, there's lots of questions, there's lots of reasonings that we might want to apply to this question of what technique to use and when. So we're thinking about how much is it going to cost me to use those different imaging techniques. How accessible are those imaging techniques? That doesn't just mean how accessible is it in terms of do I have it at the lab, but how easy is it to use? You know, how much training do you need to be able to use it? Is it, you know, highly specialist, or, you know, can a layperson use this with minimal amount of training? What's the purpose of your model going to be? And the purpose question is something that Dr. Kat Brown and I focused on in our paper in 2020, which was looking at burnt bone fragments. So these are fragments of burnt bone that have naturally fragmented during the heating process, and they were scanned using two different methods. The one in the red here is structured light, and then this one in blue here was micro CT. And we were looking at this feature matching because essentially we wanted to see if you could use the 3D models to still analyze whether these fit together, so physical fit analysis. And you can see that actually you've got a lot less detail in the red models than you do in the blue models. So it's much easier to match these models together when you had a higher resolution imaging technique. But is this technique good enough just for, you know, proving a point, visualizing? You wouldn't want to take this to court or do an analysis on it. There you would want to rely on the higher resolution techniques. But if you're just using it to prove your point as a visualization experiment, then actually this is fine. So you need to think about the purpose of what you're using it for. You know, we don't have access to unlimited budget. And so thinking about the purpose, can you get away with using lower resolution techniques or cheaper, more accessible techniques, depending on what you're trying to do? And Rachel did something very similar, so Dr. Rachel Carew, in 2018, where instead of looking at the actual technique, she looked at how much smoothing you should apply. So these are all human clavicles. This one up here has a limited amount of smoothing applied. This has a lot of smoothing applied. This is going to create a prettier 3D print, but of course this is more true to your original scan. So what are you using it for? How accurate do you need it to be, is a big question. And the same question can be asked when we're printing as well. You know, we have different time, cost, accessibility issues, exactly the same as we have with the imaging. How long is it going to take me to do this? But we also want to know about print quality. What's the print quality that I can achieve, but also what's the print quality that I actually need? Do I really need it to be the highest quality print? What am I using the model for? Print quality, time, cost, and accessibility also depends on your material. So there's lots of different material. Again, in this same paper, Rachel looked at using the different techniques, which all require different materials. So with the Ultimaker printer here, very similar to the Prusa printer that is shown here, that's a fused filament. So you're using melted, usually it's PLA, so a plastic-based filament. But obviously we spoke about the resin-based technology, so SLS and SLA. Sorry, and SLS being the nylon-based powders. So depending on what material you've used, you've got different consistencies, different print qualities, different time, cost, and accessibility issues to think about. You can already see here, you get a much smoother print with SLS, but it's horrendously more expensive. For an Ultimaker printer or the Prusa printer, this was about £1,000. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds for this machine. So definitely some weighing up to have been done. You then have the issue of, depending on what material you used or which printer type you've used, whether you're going to need these support materials. So the eagle-eyed of you will notice that when you are building up layers from nothing, you're going to have supports for the overhanging material, because imagine you building up, I don't know, you're trying to build a tower out of toothpaste and you're squirting out the toothpaste layer by layer. It's great if you're squirting the toothpaste on top of it itself each time, but if you try and create like an overhang, a couple of layers up, the toothpaste is just going to drop down, and that's exactly what happens in FFD printing, is that it'll start printing out the melted plastic, and you essentially end up with spaghetti if you don't have those structure supports there. But of course, the structure supports are attached to the print, and that's going to make these print artifacts. So this here is a human phalange that has been printed out, and you can see this sort of cross-hatching is because of those elements that have been used to support it during printing. And the levels of customization as well, you can see this is quite freely accessible. I can customize this during printing. The powder printers, you can't. So there's lots of different aspects to think about. We also need to think about what we're using this model for in terms of actually, you know, we're not just trying to make pretty models. Sometimes we are, and that is fine. Sometimes we are just trying to make something pretty, something engaging, a visual element to show in 3D context, and that can be great. Things like open days for teaching, for visualization in court, for example. Great. Seeing inside structures that you wouldn't usually be able to see inside. Wonderful. But we can also use 3D for loads of other things. You know, it gets wheeled out quite a lot as this visualization, but actually there's a lot of science behind it, underpinning it, that means we can use it for things like reconstructions. We can build fragments together and visualize a whole element from just the pieces, like the physical fit analysis of that bone. The beauty of creating a digital alternative also means that you've got an alternative to do physical procedures on. So again, that physical fit example, you don't want to be handling burnt fragmented bone because it's so delicate. But if I scan it and 3D print it, I can handle those 3D prints as much as I like, and I'm not going to damage the physical evidence that exists. And I'm just going to insert it's almost like a mini rant, pet hate, but we see the word preserve used quite a lot. And I just want to make the point of when I say I'm preserving evidence, I'm not preserving the actual evidence itself, but what I'm doing is creating a digital version of it to be able to rematerialize it so that I don't have to handle the physical evidence. If we go back to our bread example, just because I 3D scanned and 3D printed the loaf of bread does not mean I've preserved my bread. My bread is still going to go mouldy if I leave it on the side and don't do anything to look after it, regardless of whether I've got a 3D model of it or not. But by having a 3D model of it, if my bread does go mouldy, I haven't lost all of the data, all of the information about it. So yes, preserving in a way, but please still look after your actual evidence, I think is the point there. And prototyping and concept testing. And this is really what 3D printing was invented for, rapid prototyping. So making physical copies to allow you to test theories about things. Is this going to fit into here? How should I arrange this room? How should this bridge be built? Those sorts of big questions can be scaled right down and allow you to sort of do problems on your desk using 3D models. And you can materialize those digital models and test functionality of different bits. Does this cog work here, for example? And we can still do this as, you know, for 3D evidence. So we can make inferences and test concepts using 3D printed models, and that's really exciting. The other thing you can do, and this is something I'm particularly passionate about and want to take my research forward in this way, is using 3D digital models for virtual analyses. So things that are impossible or entirely unethical to complete physically. So specifically, I'm interested in how much, you know, force and what direction do you need to apply the force in order to break a bone. I can't be breaking donors' legs by putting them in different scenarios, but I can 3D scan them, assign that 3D model all of the physical properties and then test different scenarios in silico, so in a piece of software, computational analyses. So we can do a lot with 3D digital models and 3D physical models. So it's not just about making things pretty and showing them in a best light. But it certainly does help because I think these are beautiful. I might just be weird, but I think they're amazing. 3D forensic science then. This paper is awesome. This is again by Rachel Carew, written in 2021. And these sort of 4 things here essentially list out what this new discipline sort of looks like. So a subdiscipline of forensics, 3D forensic science. And again, name is kind of on the tin, bringing together a range of 3D techniques and approaches that have been developed within different areas of forensic science, but coming together and using those 3D techniques and approaches to sort of do new exciting things. So that might be collecting data in 3D, so taking 3D scans of entire scenes, digitizing evidential objects. It might be contributing to analysis and interpretations, so using those 3D models to conduct analysis or simulations, and then providing aids to complement testimonies. So presenting 3D virtual or physical printed models in the courtroom to aid with juror engagement and understanding. So a really cool new discipline that I'm very proud to work in. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about imaging for teaching and a little bit about imaging for court. So if we focus on teaching for now, my wonderful master's student a couple of years ago did a really lovely pilot study that was looking into the impact of using 3-dimensional models in forensic anthropology learning and teaching, specifically sort of within the context of when it was online teaching during the pandemic. So we had an online activity consisting of learning materials and a quiz. And those participants were split into 2 groups. So there was a 2D group that were provided learning materials that consisted of just 2D photographs of pathological lesions. So something like this. This is an example of osteoporosis. And then we have the 3D group, and they were provided learning materials consisting of 3D models. So these are models that were accessible on Sketchfab. And this is an example that has been uploaded by Bradford University as part of their digitised diseases. And again, is another example of osteoporosis. This is a 3D model. So the participants would have been able to, move around this, scroll around this in 3 dimensions. And what these participants did was before they were given their quiz, they self-evaluated their confidence level in their learning materials. So after giving their learning materials, how confident did they feel that they understood what was being sort of taught to them? And then they completed this learning activity and a quiz that basically evaluated how much they had learned. And they were given 6 questions, and those questions had 3D models and 2D images. So they were presented with questions with both formats of data. And then at the end, they self-evaluated their confidence in how they did in the activity. And so the study was really to address these 3 questions. Does using 3D models improve student comprehension? Do models improve perceived comprehension and confidence? And are models most effective when used alone or in conjunction with 2D models? And so our results sort of were very interesting, a little mixed. So does using 3D models improve student comprehension? Well, no, not really. The average score was actually lower using the 3D group than the 2D group. But if you look at the standard deviations, we did see more of a consistency with the 3D group. So you had some students who did really well in the 2D group and some who did not so well, whereas everyone sort of did pretty well. in the 3D group. So that was quite interesting. Does 3D models improve perceived comprehension and confidence? So this is different. So we wanted to get at this nuance between feeling confident versus being right. And actually, maybe, because even though they didn't do better in their scores, 3D participants did feel more confident in their learning. And when they were asked to explain their reported confidence, the 3D group tended to use more positive language when they were talking about their learning experience. And you can see from this table, we had more positive responses and more neutral responses and fewer negative responses. So, good things were like it was helpful, it was informative of concepts, the whole structure was visible. We had difficulties telling with 2D, unsure of test scores, and students who reported the activity made them more confident. There were more students who reported that they agreed or strongly agreed with that statement than from the 2D group. So yeah, possibly it does improve their perceived comprehension and confidence. And having confidence it is quite important when it comes to learning. Are 3D models most effective when used alone or in conjunction with 2D images? It seemed like 3D models alone or in conjunction were both quite highly rated. So you can see here in this table, the number of participants who agreed or strongly agreed that their image type alone was adequate. All 6 of the 3D group said actually the materials that they've been provided were adequate, whereas only 1 said that of the 2D materials. And again, when they asked about a combination, all students sort of agreed, regardless of which group they came from, they agreed that seeing 2D and 3D images together was useful. So when they had questions that had both the 2D and the 3D model, they found it easier to answer. So that's great. It seems like supplementing our teaching with 3D models could be really useful. And actually, arguably for me, this was the most interesting thing. So just another takeaway is how it was taught really matters. So we can, until we're blue in the face, think about, oh, did they get better test scores doing it this way or that way? Actually, it came down to the congruency. And if anyone's studied pedagogical theory, this might not be a very exciting result, but it definitely backs up our idea in that we need to be consistent. So assessing students in the same way in which they were taught, because you can see here that the 2D students in blue, when they were assessed using 2D questions, they did great. When they were assessed doing 3D questions, not so good. When they had a combination, okay. And then the opposite is true for the 3D group. So when the 3D group were provided with 2D questions, they didn't do as well as when they had the 3D questions or a combination. And so having this consistency between learning and assessment format is really important. And suggesting that students do best when they're assessed in the same format in which they were taught in, which is great. And I think the point to be made here is that a balance and a combination is key, because yes, when you are studying textbook cases, so textbook osteoporosis, for example, and you get them presented with a textbook case of osteoporosis, yes, it's very easy to say, oh yes, this is osteoporosis. It looks just like it did in the textbook. But not all cases are going to look just like they looked in the textbook. And so thinking about that balance and presenting the same pathology in multiple different ways is really important, because you're not always going to be able to guarantee at a crime scene, at an autopsy, in a forensic anthropology assessment of bones, that you're going to get textbook presentations of certain things. And then this is just the highlights really from that paper. Using 3D models was not detrimental to the comprehension. They were positively received by students, improved their confidence, and we seem to see that you know, we like this conjunction between 2D and 3D. And we just added in a caveat there to say, please don't stop teaching with real skeletal material. 3D prints and 3D models are great, but they can't be replacements of traditional labs. It was a great supplement to them, but not a replacement of. And then thinking about 3D imaging and printing for casework then, again, as I mentioned, we're kind of doing a similar thing. We want the jury to understand the evidence that they're being presented with, and can we use 3D models to help them in that understanding? So this is some great research by David Erickson that was conducted in 2019, and they created a mock jury. And they used photographs of an injury. So this here is a photograph. Here is a 3D model reconstruction, and here is the subsequent 3D print of that model. And what they did was they presented this mock jury with these different materials. And the use of that 3D imaging then improved the jurors' understanding of technical language, which in turn means that the jurors were better informed in their decision making. There's a lot more research to be done in this area, but the crux of the issue is that actually jurors seem to understand more when that testimony was supplemented with 3D models and 3D prints. So that sounds great. And then we published this paper in 2022. So Dave Erickson, Rachel Carew, myself, and lots of other collaborators who are doing casework. And it was essentially a survey of all of the casework in 3D forensic science that is happening at the moment. So 3D imaging and printing is definitely being used in England and Wales right now. And that's exciting. And they're being used as supports for courtroom testimony. At the moment, it seems very, very geared towards anatomical evidence. These were just sort of the cases that were reported back to us. So most often in serious cases, most often in those using or involving human remains. But that sounds really great, and really great in the context of Dave's previous research, where those models can help improve people's understanding. The area for further research is the fact that there currently are no guidelines of how to do this, of how to create these prints. There's no standards or a formalized process. So there's not very much support for the people that are producing these models, and that's something that we want to change, and is very much on our radar for future directions. So Rachel and myself co-founded, and Dave as well, co-founded this virtual technologies research group with the Forensic Capability Network. And the idea behind this research group is to develop these guidelines and protocols to best support people who do want to use this within forensic investigations, to try and get a bit more standardization and ensure that we are all sort of working towards the same goal. So yes, we have some clear benefits of imaging and printing, both for teaching and in the courtroom. It's interactive, it's engaging, it's reflective of real life. One of the things that I probably should have mentioned right at the start is, of course, we live in 3D, and so it's really important that we are presenting students with information that is relevant to real life scenarios. So it's reflective of 3D. We all live in 3 dimensions. You have that increased realism when compared with 2D materials, which kind of leads into this physical 3D object impact. So that's great. It's more impactful when you're holding something in your hands. It's easier to learn about it. allows this interactions with objects that pose hazards. So again, as I spoke about with those 3D prints of the burnt bone, you don't want to be damaging the bone, falling apart, so you can 3D print those. And increased in visual information and context. So getting those three-dimensional context is really great. But there are some caveats. We need to be careful of this introduction and bias. Of course, you know, by presenting 3D evidence, you are making it more impactful, therefore it's more emotive. And so are you going to be introducing some bias there? And on that similar vein, thinking about the psychological impact, I spoke about this earlier in the week with the SCN, in that actually people, when they go to court, are not being you know, won't have expected to be presented with, you know, a 3D printed skull to hold, and that could be quite psychologically traumatic, not just for the people in the jury who are expected to hold these things and pass them around, but also people who are in the audience within the courtroom. So thinking about our psychological impact there. We might also be influencing or introducing a technological barrier. So if we're presenting 3D models, not every student has access to you know, the software or anything that allows them to interact with the material that way. Some students, mature students, perhaps are so used to working with you know, 2D photographs that actually it becomes quite difficult to then learn the new software, learn the new technology, and then try and learn the subject matter. So you're actually putting these blockers in place by using this technology. And that, of course, comes alongside with accessibility issues as well. Not everyone has you know, the same approach to using these technologies. It could be great. You could be providing more accessibility in terms of if you had blind students, for example, who wouldn't be able to interact with a 2D photograph, but can interact with a 3D print or a 3D model. But that goes the other way. If you have someone who, you know, has particular learning differences, for example, that technology is just going to be an absolute blocker to them, then no, it's not a very effective way of transmitting this information. The other thing is that it is kind of gimmicky. VR, AR, 3D printing, all of these sort of really cool, exciting new technologies, they can garner quite a lot of attention, but sometimes they can get a bit gimmicky. So it's trying to make sure that with that balance between the excitement, but also being sensible in terms of scientifically, what are they showing, what are we using them for, and are we being sensible with that? I feel a bit bad leaving on the caveat slide, sort of leaving on a bit of a negative downer. But actually, it's all really amazing. If you want to speak to me more about any of this, my email address is there. 3DIP Forensics is a company that Rachel Carew and I own, that covers all things consultancy in terms of 3D imaging. And then I'm also on Twitter as well. So hit me up if you ever want to talk about 3D imaging or printing. Thank you so much.